Okay. So, hi everyone, and welcome to the third webinar of this webinar series on how to stay well while doing qualitative research. This series is kindly supported by the Trinity College Dublin Postgraduate and Community Wellbeing Fund, and I'm very happy that you all found your way here today. I am delighted to have Lee-Ann Fenge with us today, who will talk about the role of positionality and preparedness while doing sensitive research. This webinar will be structured into two parts. We will first have a presentation by Lee-Ann, which is then followed by a Q&A and an interactive discussion. So make sure to take note of any comments you might have or questions which come up during the presentation. Before we start, I would like to introduce Lee-Ann. Lee-Ann is a professor of social care in the Faculty of Health and Social Sciences at Bournemouth University. She's a registered social worker, and she has always been very committed to advancing the professional evidence base of social care practitioners. Her research has focused on participatory and arts-based methods to engage with seldom heard voices, and she's passionate about working in partnership with those who use health and social care services to create new knowledge to inform practice. Her research includes participatory arts-based projects with older LGBT citizens, young people with disabilities, and homeless people. Most recently, she has been working on a number of funded projects exploring the impact of financial scams on vulnerable groups. And this includes working on the development of learning tools for community health professionals to widen understanding of the risks posed by financial scams and how best to support vulnerable victims. Lee-Ann has also conducted studies into how sensitive research affects researchers, and I'm very happy that she's here with us today to share what she has learned during her research, but also during her own experience. So I think you should be able now to share your screen.
Thank you very much. I shall try. These things sometimes never work as planned, but oh, there we are. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for that introduction.
I have to do a thing about Sean at lunchtime, so.
Oh, I can hear someone. Someone's not muted. So just to give a little bit more information about my background, I was originally a social worker. I'm still a registered social worker, and so I'm aware of, I suppose, the impact of working in a relationship-based way with people in society, and the impact that that has on professional groups. And I guess as an academic, I've become increasingly interested in the way that as researchers, we are also often coming into contact with quite difficult information or situations. Yet there isn't quite the same support system around researchers as there are social workers in practice. So hopefully today what I'm going to do is to illustrate my discussion with some work that I undertook recently into the impact of undertaking sensitive research on researchers, but also to sort of illustrate that with my own experience of being a researcher and how I've been affected by some of the situations that I've come into contact with. Oops, trying to move this on. Okay, so undertaking qualitative research, and most of my experience has been using qualitative methods, and that's because I guess the research I've been involved with has always been trying to understand more the lived experience of the individual, and qualitative research fits that approach much more comfortably than a quantitative approach. And when we're engaging with that lived experience of people lives. It can bring us into contact with stories and narratives and data which can be potentially disturbing and challenging. And as part of my role here at Bournemouth University, I lead a research centre which is called Centre for Seldom Heard Voices. And as part of that, our focus is on engaging marginalised and seldom heard groups, particularly through qualitative approaches where we can capture the lived experience and the voice of those that perhaps are seldom heard in research. And necessarily through that process, you sometimes come into contact with very difficult stories, very difficult life histories that people have had, very difficult challenges, which I think as a researcher can sometimes prove challenging, as to think, well, what do I do with that information? Both in terms of how you honour that information to create an impact with it, but also there's a sort of responsibility to handle those stories sensitively and in a way that's mindful of the experience of those that have shared it with you. So research with marginalised groups or sensitive topics may place us in quite emotionally disturbing situations. We may hear stories about abuse or violence that we hadn't quite expected to hear when we entered the room with the individual, and that can be quite challenging, particularly if there's a resonance with our own life experiences. As a social worker, with social work training, we're very much taught to be mindful of the use of self and to develop a sort of a reflective awareness of the impact that situations can have on us, as well as the impact we can have on others. But I don't think that's necessarily so in research, that we don't offer that same perspective sometimes for researchers or PhD students in the same way that we would do if you were coming from a professionally qualifying background. But you can as equally be exposed to quite difficult information and as a result experience vicarious trauma by some of the difficult stories and some of the difficult material that you might be coming into contact with as a researcher. And I think that's equally so. I think one of the areas we don't even sometimes consider is how those that transcribe research material may equally be exposed to very difficult information that they have no preparation to deal with. I think alongside that, we need to reflect on those sort of ethical dilemmas that can come from research, which are particularly linked to issues of power and ownership and voice, and I suppose an appreciation that actually as a researcher we are in quite a powerful position, and we do have to be mindful of the way that we work with individuals who may be very powerless or often silenced, and that we respond to what they share with us in a thoughtful and reflective manner. And it's also about whose voice are we representing, and ensuring that we represent those voices in an authentic way. I think a key area for all researchers is about reflecting on your own positionality as a researcher. How are you coming to this research? And I think that can be particularly challenging when perhaps you have another role to play. So for those that might be practitioner researchers who are already working in a field, whether that be a field of working with supporting women in refuges, or working with children and families, and have then taken on research as a sort of a second phase of their career. Being aware of how you approach your participants, I think, is key here. which can lead to, role conflict or questions about whether I'm approaching this research as a researcher or whether I've still got my social work hat on or my counselling hat on. So I think that there needs to be a deal of reflection here to think about your own positionality within that research. And I've linked in there to an article that one of my old PhD students wrote, that we wrote, which was published last year. She was a practitioner in children's services, a social worker, but her area of research had grown out of that experience. So her research concerned researching children who are violent towards their parents. But I remember when we were in our supervision sessions, we had very long conversations about the ethics of researching a topic that's so close to your own practice experience, and B, how you handle those interviews as a researcher rather than a practitioner. Because I think when you're listening to stories of abuse or violence as a practitioner, you're always thinking of how you help someone to solve that issue or solutions, I guess, to that. But as a researcher, we're really there to listen and not to intervene. And I think when you are a practitioner researcher, there has to be an element of really thinking sensitively about your own positionality and what that means to the way that you're undertaking your research, and being mindful that you are a researcher. You're not there to intervene, you're there to listen to the story that's being told, which is very different to your own practitioner identity. I think that also links into insider-outsider perspectives and your relationship to the particular topic or community under study. So again, if you're researching a topic that reflects your own experience or an experience that you've had in life, you may need to be mindful, therefore, that you have particular insider perspectives or privilege perspectives or a particular lens on that topic that you wouldn't have if you were coming to that subject matter completely fresh without any insider perspectives. So I think when we're talking about positionality, it's really about adopting a stance where you reflect on where you are in relation to the research and to the participants, and that you remain mindful through the process that you're not perhaps slipping into being a practitioner, that you are a researcher in that particular situation. Now, I think when we're talking about keeping well whilst undertaking research, there's something about being prepared, how we prepare ourselves for engaging in field work, and indeed how we prepare ourselves to become researchers in general. And this idea of preparedness came out of a particular piece of research that I undertook a couple of years ago with a colleague from Chester University, and we were both interested in the emotional impact on researchers of undertaking research on sensitive topics. Now that came out of both of our own experiences. I'd undertaken some research previously into bereavement, and I guess had been probably taken by surprise how listening to some of the narratives I heard about bereavement and loss actually had a resonance for my own experiences and touched me on quite a deep emotional level. And I think that's particularly so when you're dealing with, when you're interviewing individuals where there's quite high emotion in a situation, and you may be dealing with someone who's in tears or really unable to proceed with the interview at times because of their own emotionality linked to the topic. My colleague in Chester, Lisa Oakley, who I've published around this topic on, has a great deal of experience in researching spiritual abuse, and similarly had been in her research listening to stories of abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, coercion, which again, when we were having an informal discussion, you know, she said to me, I'm actually finding this really, you know, I'm finding this difficult to deal with and to hear. And what do we do with that sort of, you know, where do we take that as researchers when we're finding it difficult to deal with what we're hearing? So we undertook a piece of research with 10 researchers at various stages of career development. So that included early career researchers through to mid-career researchers, through to experienced researchers, professors, and we've published around this. And this notion of being prepared came out of that research, and I think later on I'll be showing some of the quotes that came from that. But I think it also links back to how our institutions prepare us as particularly as early career researchers to undertake research. And it's not just, you know, when we enroll as doctoral students, becoming aware of the process of doctoral study and the various expectations and timelines and ethics approval and reviews and those sorts of things. But it is being able to have, I guess, discussions with your supervisors about your preparedness to deal emotionally with some of the topics that you might hear if your research, for example, is on a sensitive topic such as something linked to violence or abuse or loss or, you know, those sorts of things. So I guess it's thinking about how prepared you are, you know, that you do read around this, that you think about your own emotional needs and your own emotional preparedness, and it's about that then therefore being prepared and having some resources to hand to support you in that process. Now, as I said, the research that we did included researchers that were undertaking quite a wide variety of research, including sex work, family violence, looking at issues of offending, spirituality and trauma, child abuse linked to faith and belief. So all of those researchers that were part of the sample had come forward, sort of self-identify themselves as having had, I suppose, contact with quite emotionally disturbing stories and narratives as part of their research. And as you can see from the sample, it includes people who've got many years experience in research to those that are at the very early stages of their research careers. But interestingly, the challenges that we face with dealing with the emotional aspects here can affect us at any stage in our research journey, and probably also reflects where we are in our own life journeys at that point, and what sort of things will be resonating with our own experience at that point in our own lives. So in terms of lack of preparedness, I think some of the key themes that came out of that was that the institution itself, the universities themselves, perhaps weren't preparing students to deal with some of the challenges of the topics that they were researching in their studies. So, for example, one student reported, or not one researcher, this wasn't a student, reported that they hadn't any training on how to deal with people with mental health issues or people specifically that are vulnerable. Yet they found themselves going in and asking these individuals very sensitive questions without really having any, I suppose, prior training or preparedness to think about what might the impact on that person be of asking them that question. And if that person becomes really upset, what do I do to deal with that? Now, I know through ethics processes, we always think of supporting our participants, not causing harm to our participants, of having maybe organisations that we can refer someone to if they do become upset. But I think that's very different to be facing a situation where actually you feel a little bit out of your depth when you're interviewing someone who has a particular need or experience that you feel you don't understand. And I think that was what one of our other participants picked up. You have lots of consent forms, ethics, all of those sorts of things, but actually who's there to talk to you as a researcher? And I think this goes back to the sort of contract that you have with your supervisors. Now that's perhaps easier when you're a PGR, because you have supervisors and you have that mechanism to discuss with your supervisors if you're feeling, difficulties within your study, be those, emotional difficulties with the topic or anything else. But I think once we're sort of qualified researchers and we're bringing in research grants and we're sort of on our own to a certain extent, sometimes there are less opportunities to access that type of emotional support. So perhaps it's looking at how we create those within our own peer groups, and having some opportunity to share with other researchers within your faculty challenges that you might have, and learning from how they deal with their own challenges. And as one of our participants said, I felt like I needed support after a difficult interview, but I was on my own as an experienced researcher. So what do you do? Where do you go with that? Who can you share it with? Well, again, there's nothing at the moment. And it is looking at, I guess, for yourself, thinking about what training can you access that might prepare you for this? What is it within the ethics process that we can also enable ourselves to not only be thinking of the well-being of our participants, but in fact the well-being of researchers through that process? And also I think about how we can use the supervision process as a safe space to be able to share some of those perhaps more challenging emotional elements that come out of researching certain topics. So what might lack of preparedness create? Well, in some of these situations, it's about, dealing with raw emotion after you've actually had quite a difficult interview. So one of our participants said, I got on the train and I just suddenly started to feel really queasy, really sick. And it took me by surprise. And I think that can happen. It's, again, it's about that preparedness. What do I do if I do hear something that's very difficult? How can I deal with that on an emotional level and process it myself? Another participant said, I think what affected me as I left was that I don't think I'd expected it to be involving sexual abuse. And I think that can happen in any research, that you set out what you think the interview is going to be about, but if it's a more of a narrative or unstructured interview, actually the participant can drop anything into that conversation, and that can take you by surprise. And this participant said the one that really affected me the most was how she'd normalised the violence in her life and normalised the fact that she would end up dead within the next 2 years. And as a researcher, what do you do with that? Where do you take that information, that upset that you felt, that shock? Can you take that back and share that with someone, your supervisor or a peer, to try and work out how that's affected you on an emotional level? I think also in terms of the preparedness, sometimes it's realizing that your research only goes so far, and I think I always say this to PhD students, you're not going to change the world with your study. This is about you developing as a researcher. And sometimes, therefore, it's dealing with the disappointment that, however groundbreaking your research and your findings are, it's probably not going to have a global impact, or certainly not immediately. And again, one of our participants said, I honestly thought I could change the world. I really did. And I was crushed when it didn't happen. And they sort of reflected on the naivety of what they experienced through that process. So something here about being prepared. How can you prepare yourself? And our participants were reflecting on trying to understand what might be involved here, trying to understand the type of stories that you might hear. Someone else said, I think it should definitely be on PhD curriculums. I think there's a need to be a dedicated session, really, thinking about how, if you are researching sensitive or difficult topics, it might affect you emotionally and the type of support that you might need to deal with that. Someone else reflected on the need to be able to create a safe space in which you can reflect on difficulties that you might encounter as a researcher. And again, I think supervision can be a safe space for that. Equally, it may be that you have peer supervision with other PGRs that provides that safe space in which you can share difficulties and support one another. And another researcher said there must be a place where we can debrief. It's unacceptable that somebody hears really distressing stories and then doesn't know where to put it. And I think it goes back to raising this with universities and looking at institutional responsibility, I guess, to provide mechanisms that support staff when they're dealing with research on very difficult or sensitive topics. Other people spoke about needing support all the way through the research process, however experienced you are. Thinking about whether there are networks within your institution or between institutions which actually provide that space where researchers can get peer support, support from others that perhaps have gone through similar situations with their own research. And I think also that awareness that perhaps as researchers we need to do a bit of self-reflection before we start, to make sure that we're actually in a good place, that we're not emotionally very vulnerable when we're going out to individuals who might also be emotionally very vulnerable. And I guess it's about timing. If you are thinking of researching something that's quite a sensitive or difficult topic, is it the right time for you now to be doing that? And really reflecting on your own needs as a researcher. Other people also talked about the importance, I suppose, in promoting your own well-being is taking regular breaks, whether that's a day away or a weekend away, to unwind and to really sort of create a gap and a space between what you're researching and all of that sort of data and information that you're absorbing, to have some space in which you can reflect. And I think that's probably a wise comment for everyone, really, that we do provide spaces where we can step out of the demands of work to sort of recharge ourselves to a certain extent. And reflective practice is a key part of this. I think, and I don't think we really, when we're preparing people to become researchers, sort of emphasize this enough. As part of that process, you are using yourself as a researcher, and I think there should be a commitment to self-inquiry, a readiness to challenge and change things as part of that. And I think that's also thinking about your own beliefs, your own values. I always say to my doctoral students when they start the process, prepare to be unsettled by this, because when you're researching, when you're, I suppose, widening your appreciation of what we know, what we don't know, and appraising where knowledge comes from, that can unsettle our preconceived ways of viewing the world. It can unsettle our beliefs and values. And I think certainly in the first phases of your research, it can unsettle what you thought you knew about what you were doing and how you were going to do it. So it is being open. It's about being available, I suppose, to think critically about what you're doing, and your own part in that process, questioning your beliefs and attitudes. As I say, your supervision relationship can provide that. It can provide a safe, reflective space, but there may also be opportunities for peer supervision with other students or other researchers in your institution. And I think
it's 1:30 now. Maybe another
okay.
5 minutes or so, but just for the time.
Thank you. So I think as we think about the next half an hour, I think it's about thinking about what institutions offer, what institutions need to offer in terms of researchers, looking at opportunities, I guess, as researchers to develop more of a reflective stance on what we're doing, and thinking about how might your PhD supervision support you to deal better with the emotional aspects of research. What other organisational support is available? How does the ethics review process help with this? Ethics committees, what other supports are there within the institution? And I think also, I don't want to, I think there is a big organisational responsibility to be thinking about this. But I think there's also things that we can do in terms of self-care. Now, that's not to take away from the fact that, there are organisational responsibilities to provide support, but there are also things that we can do to keep ourselves well as we're researching and, in our working life. So think about practices that reduce stress, or think about practices that actually increase your stress and how you deal with them. So that might be about having a day when you're focusing on your research and you don't respond to emails immediately, for example. Thinking about what you're eating, your physical fitness, and your immunity during that process. Time management's a key one there. How you manage your time, how you don't create situations where actually you leave things to the last minute and then actually that becomes more stressful to deal with. Being mindful and taking time out to relax, to enjoy yourself, to do things that are equally important in your life. And avoiding compassion fatigue. When we're aware of listening to difficult stories, how can you take a break from that? How can you find support to deal with that? Part of that might be about becoming more assertive about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do, but also being good to yourself within that. And I just wanted to leave you with this notion of self-compassion, which was defined by Neff as creating and nurturing a relationship with the self that allows a sense of caring and warmth. So being kind to yourself and turning compassion inwards sometimes, and realizing that you're a human and that actually it's fine to be affected by some of the things that you hear in the course of research, because those sometimes are very difficult stories. We're not superhumans, we're not robots, and we do need to demonstrate compassion to ourselves, that it's okay not to feel okay sometimes, and it's okay to ask for help. So that's the end of my presentation. I put some references there for anyone who wants to do further reading around that. And I'll hand back to Cordula now.
Thank you so much.
Do I need to unshare? Yes, I do.
Yes, I think it should be possible at the bottom. Thank you so much for this insightful presentation. Personally, I thought it was so interesting. It also resonates with so much I experienced during my own PhD research. And it's also really good to see research being done on the topic, because it also makes you feel like you're not the only one who's experiencing. You can read, okay, other people are also affected. And yeah, so it was very interesting. Thank you. And I thought I would stop now, maybe the recording. Just, I don't know whether everyone feels comfortable sharing or talking while the recording is on. So